Dragons in the Water by Madeleine. 8. Murder. For Simon, the next minutes were a haze of terror. Polly pulled him roughly away. "We have to get Daddy." Why is he in the hearse?" Simon asked stupidly. "What is Cousin Forsyth doing in the hearse?" Charles said. "Cousin Forsyth is dead, Simon. There's a dagger in his chest." Chronology got all upset. Simon could not remember in which order things happened. Geraldo, trained to obey orders, reminded them that Dr. O'Keefe had told them to stay in the prow of the ship. "But he doesn't know!" Polly cried. "He doesn't know about Cousin Forsyth. We have to tell him." Simon was not sure how he and Polly and Charles got to the O'Keefe's double cabin. Who had gone for Dr. O'Keefe, where he had been found. Had he brought them to the cabin? Certainly he had told them to stay there until he came for them. They were to lock the door from the inside and under no circumstances to open it to anybody else. "It's sort of locking the stable door after the horse is gone," Polly said. Charles sat cross-legged on his bunk. "Is it? There's a murderer at large on this ship. Someone has already tried twice to kill Simon." "But I thought it was Cousin Forsyth," Polly exclaimed. "I thought he wanted Simon out of the way." "Somebody obviously wanted Cousin Forsyth out of the way." Charles looked at Simon, who was sitting still and upright in the small chair. They all stiffened as they heard a key turn in the lock. They did not know who had access to the key to the cabin besides Dr. O'Keefe and the two stewards, and although they trusted Jan, either the chief steward or the first officer was lying about the key. Simon realized that everybody on the Orion was under suspicion, even those he thought of as incorruptible and his friends. Dr. O'Keefe came in, his face markedly pale under his tan. Even the red of his hair seemed more muted by gray than usual. "Daddy!" Polly jumped up. "Please send for Canon Tallis." He replied, "I have thought about it, Polly, but I'm not sure that it's fair to ask Tom to come running whenever anything difficult happens." "But, Daddy, this isn't something difficult. This is murder, and Simon is in danger." "Polly, we'll have to wait." "But you'll go on thinking about sending for him." "I'll think about it, Polly, but I doubt if I'll do more than that. Now, the captain wants us all in the salon. Just us, all the passengers, plus Jan and Geraldo." "Jan and Geraldo haven't done anything wrong." "I doubt if they have, though Jan's story about the key is not very convincing. In any case, we must all be questioned. The captain will speak to the crew and officers separately. Jan and Geraldo were the ones in closest contact with the passengers. Simon?" Dr. O'Keefe held out his hand. Simon put his hand into Dr. O'Keefe's. The passengers were all sitting in the salon, much as they had been when Simon, Polly, and Charles were first introduced to them. Dr. Wordsworth was presiding over the teapot. It seemed that disasters produced tea parties. But on the first day it had been cold, with steam noisily pushing through the radiators. Now it was hot, and Cousin Forsyth was not there. It was stifling. The fans did not seem to stir the air. Geraldo stood by the door nearest his galley. The tidy arrangements of cups and saucers, cream pitchers, tea and coffee pots seemed to give him a sense of order and reassurance. Jan ten Zwick stood at the 4 windows, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, which was turned to the passengers. Charles sat on the sofa beside his father. Simon and Polly stood. The captain sat, looking somberly at his passengers. Mr. Theo, the Smiths, the 2 professors looked at him questioningly. Dr. Wordsworth broke the silence. "Captain Van Leyden, why have you brought us here?" "There has been an unfortunate, deplorable occurrence." He shook his head at the inadequacy of his own words. "There has been a tragedy." He paused. Dr. Wordsworth whispered to Dr. Eisenstein, though they could all hear her. "Where's Fair? I thought we were all summoned to the salon." "Mr. Fair is dead," the captain said harshly. Dr. Wordsworth dropped the teapot. Tea flooded over the tea tray and onto Dr. Wordsworth, onto the floor. Mrs. Smith let out a breathy shriek. Geraldo and Jan began mopping the floor. "But he can't be dead," Dr. Eisenstein said. "He was perfectly all right at breakfast." Dr. Wordsworth patted her orange shorts with her napkin. "How clumsy of me. I'm sorry. The teapot was unexpectedly hot." It must have been a heart attack, Mr. Smith suggested. Mrs. Smith quavered. But he was so young. The captain waited until comparative order was restored. Then he said heavily, Mr. Forsyth Fair did not die of natural causes. He was murdered. Mrs. Smith clutched her husband's hand. No, no, Dr. Eisenstein said. But who would? Dr. Wordsworth reached with trembling hands for her empty teacup, lifted it, set it back on the table. It has to be someone on the ship. It must be someone in this room. Stop, stop, Mrs. Smith wailed. How could you suggest such a thing? Who could possibly have wanted to murder Mr. Fair? Mr. Smith put a restraining hand on his wife's knee. Somebody did, Patty, and that's a fact. Simon moved almost deliberately into the state of numbness which had protected him at the time of his parents' deaths, although now there was no grief and outrage, only shock. And he had had too much of death. He would be involved in it no more. He did not hear what anybody was saying. He did not want to hear. But after a while he felt that somebody was trying to penetrate his shell of protection, and he turned and saw Mr. Theo looking at him, his eyes fierce under bushy brows. Before Simon could drop his gaze, Mr. Theo nodded at him reassuringly. It was almost as though Aunt Leonis was with him, expecting him to behave like a man and not like a child. He listened to the captain telling the passengers about the vanished portrait, about talking on the radio with the police. And when the shocked exclamations had died down, Polly raised her hand for permission to speak as though she were in school. Van Layden said, Yes, Miss Polly. Aunt Leonis, Simon's Aunt Leonis. She's the only one who might possibly know. You know what, Miss Polly? Why Jan's Cristano name, Umar, is on the back of the portrait. It might give us a clue. What? What's that? Dr. Wordsworth demanded. Simon closed his eyes and mind during the explanations. A detective in our midst, Mr. Theo said in approval. You could get in touch with Miss Leonis through the radio officer, could you not, Captain? Yes, that is an intelligent suggestion. In any case, I would inform her of what has happened. The captain nodded. You would like to speak to her, Master Simon? Simon opened his eyes, and the captain had to repeat the question. Oh, yes, please, sir, but the nearest phone is quite a way down the road at the filling station by the bus stop. There's usually someone there who's willing to drive over to Faro and fetch her. The captain's grim face relaxed slightly as he looked at the boy, who reminded him so strongly of his own fair son home in Amsterdam. All right, we will start the wheels turning as soon as possible. He rose and spoke to the assembled group. You are free to go where you please, though I expect you not to go below this deck. He looked at Polly and Charles. It is a hot day, but I do not think that you would wish to go to the prow. No, Polly said, no. Simon's mind's eye flashed him a vision of the hearse and the strange still body there, and he shuddered. The captain dropped his hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. Come, Simon, we will go to the radio room. It was over an hour before Aunt Leonis reached the filling station phone, during which time both Dr. O'Keefe and Mr. Theo made calls. Dr. O'Keefe to Beniceid Island, Mr. Theo to Caracas to say he would be delayed but hoped to arrive in good time for Emily's first concert, which was still a full week off. Then he put in a call to England, and for this he asked Simon to step outside. Why would Mr. Theo be calling England? At this moment it did not seem to Simon to be very important. The captain talked again with the police in Lake of Dragons and put in a call to Holland. When Aunt Leonis was finally on the phone, the captain spoke to her first. He told her briefly what had happened, then listened carefully. Then he said, I am glad that you will come. I know that my government would wish to see this more than unpleasantness, this dreadful event, resolved as soon as possible. We will make arrangements to have you flown here at your earliest convenience. You will come at once? That is good. He handed the headset to Simon. Aunt Leonis's voice crackled strangely, but was quite comprehensible. I will be with you by tomorrow evening, Simon. I have read Quentin Fair's letters. There was more than Umar on the back of the portrait, but we will not talk of it till I arrive. Then static took over and he could make nothing out of the last garbled words. No matter. Aunt Leonis was coming. There was still horror, but if Aunt Leonis was going to be with them in Venezuela, then somehow she would manage to bring order out of chaos, as she always had done. The O'Keefes were with Mr. Theo in the salon. Simon was being taken care of by Mynheer Boone. Dr. O'Keefe said, "I think it will be better if Simon sleeps with Charles in my cabin, and I'll take his. We may well be detained for a few days in Port of Dragons. You kids will help make the transfer, won't you?" "Of course, Daddy," Polly said. "Let's find him and get him settled, and then let's put on our bathing suits and splash around in the pool. I'm not being cold-blooded. I just think it would make us feel cheerier." Mr. Theo nodded. "How many of us will fit in, do you think?" Then he looked at Dr. O'Keefe. "I'm an old man, Doctor, and I've never been very patient. At the end of my life, I find that I can't wait for the prudent moment for things. I have to snatch the time when I have it." Dr. O'Keefe looked at him inquiringly. Mr. Theo said, "When I suggested to you that we call Tom Tallis in London, you felt that we should wait. I must confess, I have called him." Dr. O'Keefe asked quietly, "And?" "I was very cryptic. When he got on the phone, I said, 'Tom, this is Theo. I will be delayed in getting to Caracas, but hope to be in time for Emily's concert. You will want to come.' Then I hung up." Polly clasped her hands. "Oh, Mr. Theo, do you think he'll come?" Mr. Theo said, "Tom and I have known each other since we were both rather wild young men in Paris. It is not my wont to be cryptic. Tom will come." He turned to Dr. O'Keefe. "I hope you're not angry with me for going over your wishes." "I think I'm relieved," Dr. O'Keefe said. The passengers of the Orion, with the notable exception of Mr. Fair, were gathered on the aft deck. Mr. Theo, in an old-fashioned one-piece black bathing suit, stood in one corner of the wooden pool and let the rolling of the ship splash salt water over him. Whenever there was a heavy swell of the water sloshed over the sides of the pool onto the deck. Simon, Polly, and Charles joined him. The salt water felt cool and delicious. Mr. and Mrs. Smith found the steep wooden sides of the pool difficult to climb over. They reclined in deck chairs. Mrs. Smith wore white terry cloth shorts, a white sleeveless shirt, and white sneakers and socks. Despite her softly wrinkled skin, she looked as fresh and clean as a kitten. "I'm all right, Patty," Mr. Smith whispered. "He can't hurt us now." She shuddered. "What a terrible thing to say. What could have... Oh, Odell, I'm frightened. I'm so frightened." The two professors had pulled their chairs to the opposite side of the deck from the Smiths. Dr. Wordsworth glistened from suntan lotion. She wore orange shorts and a flowered halter, and her back glowed with copper and was smooth and supple, though the slack muscles of her upper arms betrayed her age. She brought out a white nose guard and put it over her nose to protect it from the sun, adjusted her straw hat to shade her eyes. Dr. Eisenstein had pulled her chair into the shade of the canvas canopy. Dr. Wordsworth's whisper was explosive. "Why don't you say it?" Startled, Dr. Eisenstein looked up from her notebook. "Say what?" "What I can see you're thinking." Dr. Eisenstein looked sad and tired. "No, I'm not, Inez. I'm numb with horror that such a thing could have happened, but I don't think that you had anything to do with it. You know that I hated him." "I know that you're not a murderer." Inez Wordsworth held out her hands and looked at them wonderingly. "I could have murdered him, I think, if I'd been angry enough. If he'd raked up the past publicly, but he couldn't do that without implicating himself. And to do him justice, I don't think he would have. We did love each other once." She let her hands fall into her lap, the nails like blood. "Odd to admit that I could kill if I were angry enough, but I didn't kill him." "I know you didn't," Dr. Eisenstein said gently. Dr. Wordsworth readjusted her nose guard. "Oh, Ruth, I admit I wished him dead that first day he got on the ship, but not this way. A nice lingering death from some excruciatingly painful disease would have been fine with me. So why am I so squeamish about murder?" "Because the murderer is still on board. It's unbelievable. It can't be one of the passengers." "Why not?" Dr. Eisenstein shook her head. "I find it impossible to believe that anybody on this ship, passenger or sailor, is a murderer, and yet somebody is." "Let's hope it's a sailor." But a sailor? What could a sailor have against a passenger? Someone he's never met before. Quite a few of the sailors are from South America, and I've told you that Fernando Propais, or Forsyth Fair, was involved in all kinds of minor underworld stuff when I knew him, and a leper doesn't lose his spots. It may be some kind of private smuggler's vendetta. That would be understandable, at least, Dr. Eisenstein said. I suppose the Orion will be swarming with police tomorrow morning when we dock. Inez Wordsworth was white under her tan. Her hands clenched. Oh, God, the police always look into everybody's background in case of murder. They'll find out about me. Not necessarily. You have an American passport. But don't you see how vulnerable I'll be if the police get hold of my record? There's no reason they should. Dr. Wordsworth relaxed slightly, letting her hands unclench. Thank you, dear Ruth. Jail once was enough for me, and there are the officers to consider. Lyle Spoon, for instance, watching the bridge games but refusing to take a hand. It was FP he was watching, not you and the Smiths. And the captain, Dr. Eisenstein continued, you mentioned only last night that the captain was formidably polite with Farr, the kind of rigid courtesy one reserves for someone one heartily dislikes. Dr. Wordsworth smiled wryly. In my youth, I used to think I might like to be a spy or a Secret Service agent. I don't think I'm cut out for it after all. You'd better use some of my suntan lotion, Ruth. Your nose is getting red. You get a lot of reflection from the sun, even under the canopy. Oh, God, I wish we were with your Quistanos and all this behind us. On the bridge, the master of the ship looked out to sea. Lyle Spoon was at the helm. Van Leyden said, You were on the bridge this morning. Are you certain there was nothing on the radar? There were the usual fishing ships, but only a few, and they did not approach. They remained well on the outer range of the radar. Van Leyden's jaw tightened. My heart sank when I recognized the man. But in my most extreme pessimism, I never thought of murder. It would seem that somebody attempted to steal the portrait, was caught by Fair, who was then murdered, and the portrait removed. Do you have any ideas? Jan is the only person we know who has an interest in the portrait, but I cannot bring myself to believe that Jan Tanswick would murder, but I do not know what his Quisano blood might make him do. Jan is only part Quistano, the captain said. He is essentially Dutch in looks, but there are many qualities in him which come from the Quistanos. The captain looked broodingly at the radar machine, of which he was so proud. That doesn't make him a murderer. Of course not. I didn't mean to imply, but I do not understand why he had the key to cabin 5, and why invest this wild tale of my having found the key on Fair's crossword puzzle. His lying disturbs me greatly. Never before have I known Jan not to tell the truth, nor I, the captain said. Geraldo should keep his key cupboard locked. I dare say he will from now on, but there has never before been an occasion to be concerned when we have been at sea. Perhaps the possibility of further trouble has occurred to Dr. O'Keefe. You remember, he's changing cabins with Simon. A wise decision, Van Leyden said, but I do not wish the boy to be alone at any time until we are certain no one wishes him harm. I'm not sure that such was in O'Keefe's mind, otherwise wouldn't he himself have shared his cabin with the boy. It seems likely he merely reasoned that it would hardly be pleasant for Simon to sleep alone in that cabin. That's how I'd feel if it were my son. I think, Boone, that we must be careful not to make any assumptions about anything or anybody. Boone agreed. It is a matter for the police. Van Leyden put his hand heavily on the radar machine. Yes, it's all going to be very unpleasant. The police will be waiting when we land, and then Miss Fair's plane from La Guardia will arrive by late afternoon. Tomorrow, I suppose the police will have to meet her. I suppose the police will have her met. Yes, Boone nodded thoughtfully. It is all going to be very untidy. Was Fair a U.S. citizen? Van Leyden hit the palm of his hand against his forehead. No, as a matter of fact, he was not. How easily, he thought. The is has become a was on our tongues. He carried a Venezuelan passport. How long do you think we'll be detained? This plays havoc with our schedule. I wish I could give you an answer. I have no precedent for this experience. I had no fondness for Mr. Fair, but this is hardly the revenge I would have contemplated. You would have contemplated revenge? Van Leyden looked surprised. That was merely a figure of speech. My captain did not need a raw young sailor to avenge him. It was, in any case, not my prerogative. It's nearly time for lunch. I doubt if it will be a pleasant meal. And we'll pause there.